Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome to our first SNED Talks, Sautee Nacoochee Educational Talks, sponsored by the SNCA Adult Education Committee. I'm Priscilla Wilson. I'm the chair of the committee, which, by the way, is a bunch of great people who will not let me ask them to stand up right now. So please notice who they are on the back of your program and thank them for their hard work. And we thank you so much for showing up in support of our endeavor to create opportunities for all of us to stimulate and educate one another. Isabel Couch would be feeling very pleased indeed today. How many knew Isabel? I can't really see the hands, but for those who did not have the privilege of knowing her, Isabel was a founding member of SNCA and truly a fine educator and advocate for education. We want to thank Sam Williams, who designed our cool logo and designed all our promotional materials and program. We want to thank Linda Harding, our tech guru in the booth, who is responsible for sound, lighting, and visual aids. Vicki McMara, her able assistant. Roger Williams, i.e. SauteeLive.com, our wonderful videographer. And Dee Dee Vogt for all her wonderful ongoing support. Our theme for today is Digging In, Pursuing a Passion. Each of our three speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, and after that we'll have about a 5-minute question and answer period. And then after the program we'll have refreshments in the Crittenden room to your left just as you leave the auditorium so that you can talk further with our speakers and so that you can support our adult ed committee financially if you would like. Refreshments, by the way, are provided by Barbara Williams. And so that tells you it will not be Oreos and Hawaiian Punch. It will be something good. For your information, I think everyone here knows their way around this place, but just in case, restrooms are at each end of the hall, men's to my right and women's to my left. Exits are marked at the front and back of the auditorium. And we ask that you turn off your cell phones, please, and that you not take pictures or videos during the program. So let's get started. We thank today's speakers for bravely coming forward to be our guinea pigs and for all their preparation for today. We hope that today's talks will make many of you want to be next. And if so, I mean, we're sure that people will just be lined up asking to be the next, SNED speakers. So the fact that you're here today kind of gives you a bit of an edge. Our first speaker is Robin Chandler Wilks, who originally hails from West Virginia, but now lives in Clarksville with her husband, Steve. Robin has advanced degrees both in music education and theological studies in worship and the arts, and has taught music in just about every kind of situation imaginable. Robin Wilks.
Hello, and thank you for coming, even in spite of all the weather problems we've had. I am Robin Wilks, and I love music. When I taught high school music, my favorite class was music appreciation, and I hope to share some of that with you today. Now, what do we have here? It's something special. It's 2 tickets to the symphony. Now, what are we going to do with these? Well, first we put our props back up. Many of us go to concerts, and often. We have so many wonderful opportunities right in our own backyard that we do enjoy going to the symphony. But what if there was something that we can do to help us enjoy it even more? So why do we like good music, good art, good food? Because it speaks to us. It has something that's predictable. It has elements of surprise. It has form. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's start with something simple. Yes, something as simple as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star has form. It's called ABA. Now, what do I mean by that? Listen again. That's the first part. So we'll call that A. Now, that's the second part, and it's different from the first part, so we'll call that B. But listen to this. It's the same as the first part, so we'll call that A again. A, B, A. So where did that come from? Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Back in the 1700s, in the time of Haydn and Mozart, composers came up with templates to make their music. One of those templates was ABA form, or sonata form. A sonata is a piece of music that's written for a solo instrument, such as a piano or a flute or a violin. And so composers liked what they were doing with these templates, so they began to use it for other pieces of music, such as a symphony, which is for full orchestra, or a concerto, which is for a solo instrument that's backed up by a full orchestra. Now back to this ABA. A is the first part. It's called the exposition. This is when it introduces a theme or perhaps a secondary theme. Now, what's a theme? A theme is something that you can grasp onto. It's something you can listen for. Something you might even hum along, like. You all know that. What about this one? Or, those are all themes from very popular classical pieces of music. Okay, let's go on to the second part, B. That's called the development, in which the theme or themes are, well, developed. They're played very often. They're played in different keys, in different parts of the orchestra. It might be turned upside down or reversed. It also might be played in different keys, like from the key of C minor to the key of E flat major or to G major, and finally comes back to the original key. And in general, the composer and the performers just have fun with that theme, playing it all over the place until they're tired enough that they come back to the original A. And the A then is called the re-exposition or the recapitulation. Also, a piece of work might have an introduction before it gets into the themes. And it also might have an ending called a coda. You might even call that the cherry on top. One other thing is a big piece of music might completely repeat the first A before it goes on to the development. And that way you get the themes drummed clearly in your mind. Okay, so now that we know we're listening for specific things, let's try a symphony. Today's performance is going to be Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in C minor. Now, when you're at a concert, you look at your program and you notice that Beethoven's Fifth has 4 parts or movements. The first is Allegro con brio, which means fast and with life. The second will be Andante con moto, which means more of a walking pace, but still with movement. The third is the scherzo, which is lighter and playful, and it's a dance. And the last one is Allegro again, which is very fast. Now, for today's performance, we will only be concerned with the first movement, Allegro con brio. Oh, one other thing. When you see the names of these parts, they're named for the tempo or the feeling of it as opposed to, say, a title. Okay, so now we're going to listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But before we begin, I'm going to give you something to listen for. And you know how that goes. Okay, now this is the second theme you're going to listen for. And that goes on, but listen for those things. Now, let's listen to the first section, the exposition we know as A. That's the end of A. What happens next? Sound familiar? And then it continues to finish the first A again. So now we're at the end of the second A. And we go now into the second part, which is B, the development. Think of it as a beach ball being tossed around a sports arena. The ball or the theme is going to be tossed from the violins to the flutes to the trumpets to the bassoons and even to the drums. And if you'll notice too, the rhythmic theme will show up all over the place. Even if it's turned upside down, listen for that rhythmic theme in B. This is the end of A. And then it continues to finish B, the development. Now we're going to hear the end of that development as it goes back into A. Isn't it fun to see it in all the different parts of the orchestra? Also, with that last A, even though there are some major changes to it, all those themes are still totally recognizable. Now, we have the coda. This is the cherry on top, and it brings us to a magnificently typical Beethoven ending. So there you have it. Now, when you go to a symphony and look at the program, In the program, you will see an order of the works being played that night. You'll see bios of the conductor, of the soloists or principal players, and you'll see a rundown on each piece of music, and that's called program notes. In those program notes are usually written by the conductor, a soloist, or a music scholar who will give you the history of a piece of music as well as things to look for, such as we've talked about today. Now, one more thing. What if you are listening to another symphony, say by Mozart or Brahms? Just listen at the beginning and see if you can find the themes. You might hear it lots of times, and if you're OCD like I am, you might even count how many times you hear it. But if you want to dig a little further, then see if you can figure out the form. It could be AABA, it could be AABB. There are several other possibilities that you might be able to have. But check it out. Regardless, the chance to go to a live symphony is an experience to learn, experience to enjoy, and to cherish. So, are you ready to go with me to the symphony? Yes. Thank you. We really appreciate your coming out today, and I want to thank the committee for even getting this going. And to Linda and Vicki and all the sound crew, they're all geniuses. Thank you all so much.
So do we have questions for Robin?
Yes.
Does this structure apply to all kinds of music?
Does this
sorry.
You know,
Yes,
I'm supposed
yes.
to repeat the question.
Yeah, sorry.
He wants to know if this structure applies to all different kinds of music.
In a way, yes. Each piece of music has a structure. It may not be ABA or AABA, but there will be a structure to it. Look in your church hymnals and see what you find. It might be AABB or ABAB and so forth. Check it out.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
When you go to a concert, do you like to be surprised at the performance that you're going to hear, or do you like to be informed ahead of time?
So you're asking if Robin herself
Yes.
wants to prepare or to just be surprised.
Yes, I love to look at the program notes that we talked about.
And to listen ahead of time to that symphony?
Sometimes I'll listen ahead. But even just reading that, an example of that for the Beethoven, before you hear the second theme come in, it will be introduced by a brass fanfare that goes like this. And that might be in there, and I don't know if you remember hearing it now, but little things like that give you something to listen for.
Any others? All right. Thank you again. Yeah, Warren and I'll do it. Well, you can help if you want. Our next speaker is Warren Lanier. Warren and his wife Mary have lived in our community for over 20 years. Warren has multiple degrees in chemistry and worked as an industrial chemist for 31 years before moving to Habersham County. He has recently begun writing poetry, like his 11th cousin, Sidney Lanier. He's good at moving pianos, too.
Good afternoon. After this cold weather, I'm glad somebody turned out. But now, have you asked yourself the question, why am I going to hear something about Sidney Lanier when I know all that I need to know? Well, do you know? Well, let's find out. First, we know he was born in Macon, Georgia in 1842. This is the Lanier cottage that's still there and well maintained. And there's a Georgia historical marker out front that tells us some things about his life, and I'll try to explore some of those.
This one's different from the one.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Good?
That's better, thank you. Check the bifocals. So then we have another marker here that's in the ivy there at the cottage that marks his dates as 1842 to 1881. In between that and 1867, he married Mary Day of Macon. They raised 4 sons. He was educated at Oglethorpe University when at that time it was in or near Milledgeville. Well, those are the familiar things. Now, you know there's Lake Sidney Lanier. You'd be amazed how many folks don't know how to spell Lanier, though, or pronounce it. And then he's in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Well, now, if that's all you came for, that's it. I'm done. That didn't take very long. I'm glad of that. But if you want to know more, you have to be introduced to my genealogy suitcase. And that's why I have it back here. This suitcase represents something that was passed to me when my parents passed away. And it contains a flute and some materials and photographs and a music collection and an item from the Duke Chapel and water. And the reason the water's in there may be for me, but it's also to point out that a lot of things that happened to Sidney Lanier had to do with water. Around Macon with the rivers, around the marshes of Glen, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also that he was on the James River as in the Signal Corps with the Civil War. So, the main thing, though, that I wanted to do when I dug into this was learn more about Sidney Lanier simply because I wanted my sons, our sons, and our grandkids to get into music. And I thought the best thing to do with that was to inspire them with the fact that he was an accomplished musician. I'm not, but they are. I'm real good on CD. But this, as we came in, did you listen to the flute music? That's Sidney Lanier's music. I was able to get 2 compositions and put those on a CD for you to hear this afternoon. Now, the 2 famous poems that we know in Georgia are the Marshes of Glen and the Song of the Chattahoochee, with the Chattahoochee rising right here in White County. The Marshes of Glen are a wonderful expanse of marsh down around Brunswick, Georgia. You may be wondering what the bridge in the distance was. That's the Sidney Lanier Bridge. It's a new cable bridge there that crosses over the creek that drains all that marsh into the Atlantic. You would cross over that bridge as you were headed to Jekyll Island as you go south from Brunswick. And here's the Chattahoochee. Up where we recognize it, it's more like the picture at the top. Down below Atlanta, it looks more like the bottom. And then here's a small picture of Lake Sidney Lanier, which compounds all that river water. And we're blessed to have that much water. And if you remember from 4th grade, as I do, out of the hills of Habersham, down through the valleys of Hall, I hurry amain to reach the plain, split the rock and together again, and on down. And at that time, White County was part of Habersham County. So the geography was correct in the poem, although today it's different. Well, now let's talk about Sidney Lanier and explore this a little more. He had 2 dreams. The first was to be a research literary specialist at a German university, especially the University of Heidelberg. He longed to do that. Well, with the war-ravaged South, he had no opportunity to do that, much less the money to do that. And the second was that he wanted to leave a legacy. And he really worked hard at that as his career went on, to leave us music and poetry. And many weren't aware of his flute music. Now, what will surprise you is there are 2 academic institutions that recognize Sidney Lanier. The first I'll show you is Duke University Chapel. And right inside the portal, There are stone carvings. The three on the left are famous Christian reformers. The three on the right are called Men of the South. Well, you can immediately recognize Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee. And my wife and I said, who's that third guy? That's Sidney Lanier, poet of the South. So that's why the booklet up here about Duke University. So he is recognized there. And that's an outstanding memorial to him. The second involves Johns Hopkins. I do not have an outside photograph of Johns Hopkins University, but it houses all of Sidney Lanier's literary, music, letters, everything. All his collection is complete. And they have a Lanier room there in the Milton Eisenhower Library of rare collections. This is a monument out front, and it's actually larger than the one of Johns Hopkins. But it's a bronze, and it shows Sidney with a notebook or journal in his hand. To his right hip is where his flute and his songbook are located. And then in the background is a tribute to Sunrise, which was one of his poems from the Marshes of Glen. So he's recognized by those two academic institutions. And he was particularly interested in Johns Hopkins because it was modeled after the German universities, especially his dream of Heidelberg. Well, now let's consider the music. As I say, you heard it as you came in. You may or may not have recognized that that was a composition by Sidney Lanier. Two flautists, one a performer and one a professor, have put together the Sidney Lanier collection of his flute music. And on the right is an actual hand-drawn composition of Blackbirds, one of his flute pieces. When I look at all that and see all those complicated notes, I say, no wonder I don't play a flute. I just bring it along. Then the surprising thing is, and this is a fact that not many people recognize, and I was astounded to find that he's on an album put together by the New York Flute Club entitled The Flute Society, or The Flute in American Music, and covers the 200 years of American composers. This was put together for the U.S. bicentennial in 1975 to be ready for 1976. And here's Lanier, along with a fellow named Aaron Copland down at the bottom that you may recognize more of the 20th century. But here's the full album, and I was fortunate enough to be able to obtain it. But let's go back 100 years. Guess who played or had his music performed at the Centennial Exposition, originally in Philadelphia in 1876? Sidney Lanier was called upon to write the cantata, which he did, and it was set to music by Dudley Buck, who was a famous composer of the time. And he was really blasted by the Northern press that said, what are we doing with a Southerner? And it's not very musical, and it's also not very poetic. We don't understand why you chose this man. Well, it turns out he was thinking symphony, which connects back to what Robin said a little while ago. He was thinking 150-voice, 150-piece orchestra, a 300-voice chorus. And that's what performed. And some 300,000 folks heard that while the exposition was ongoing from May till the fall of 1876. Well, picture this. Sidney Lanier is on the platform, 3 or 4 chairs down from Ulysses S. Grant, President of the U.S. So there he is. And that's recapped with a presentation of the cantata in 1876 and one of 8 in the flute music album for 1976. Now, the song you hear right now is Wind Song, which was done by the classical flautist. And this was a composition that he wrote to impress the director of the Peabody Symphony. He very much wanted to be a part of that symphony, which was in the early days separate from Johns Hopkins, although today they're joined together. And to do that, he composed this, and he got the first flautist position in that orchestra, and he was very pleased. His second step was to appeal to the Oratory Society in New York, and that's where the New York Flute Society picked up on that. He also became first flutist in that, a flautist. And the reason there was the song. The song was Danse des Moucherons in French. Well, a moucheron is a midget, and if you go a little smaller, it's a gnat. And so that music, and you heard a part of that, and you may hear some of that in a little bit, a part of that as you came in. So you have to visualize gnats swarming over a marsh, like the marshes of Glen. But that was the music that he wrote for impressing Leopold Damrosch, founder of the Oratory Society in New York. Well, all this sounds great, pretty straightforward. Then you have to realize the considerable odds that Sidney Lanier overcame, and this is what impressed me and drove me to make this presentation. There were incredible odds because of all the things he did. He was an incurable romantic. He liked the poetry, he liked the literature, he did all those late in life. But the real stumbling block that came along was he was taken prisoner on a gunship, a British gunship that was headed up the James River. The Union troops stopped that. He was imprisoned at Fort Lookout, Maryland, which is out in the swamp. And that's another key to the water bottle here. And there in 7 months he contracted consumption, or TB as we know it. It was a month-long walk back home to Macon, where his mother was an invalid. And he endured all that. So I have tremendous respect and adoration for a man that was able to play the flute, give lectures at Johns Hopkins, and endure the battle with TB, which was his battleground for the rest of his life. And that explains why he died at 39 in 1891. He happened to die in Lynn, North Carolina. That's right up on the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And that's notable because when he died, he didn't want to be buried in Georgia. He expressed the desire to be buried in Baltimore, where he had spent many, many years, and in fact was unable to get his family together with him until he got the lectureship at Johns Hopkins. And sure enough, he's buried in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, in a plot provided by the Turnbull family. Lawrence Turnbull was a famous lawyer there, and his wife was a famous patron of Sidney Lanier. So as his life unfolds, we say, goodness, he did have incredible odds. Well, let's examine his productivity briefly. They always show him to be bearded, heavy-chested. I don't think that would have been the case by the time he was late in life. This is the collection of his poems put together by his wife. And this particular one happens to be of the 125th anniversary and published in 1967 by the University of Georgia Press. The original book is there on the right, again with that same mustache, bearded person. And on the left is one in 1920. Charles Scribner was smart enough to get all the book rights. He wrote 10 books. The last 3 or 4 down below there, he actually edited rather than write. One of the ones that was most controversial was one about science of English verse, because in that he proposes that the musicality of poetry should blend with the music. And if you're a songwriter today, you know that's the case all the time. But that was controversial in its day. Here are the front pages of a couple of books. One on the left is a bound copy of his lectures given at Johns Hopkins and to women at Peabody Institute. And the one on the right is much like The Boy's King Arthur, but it's The Boy's Froissart that was published in London, and Sidney was the editor for that. Again, sticking to his classics. And here's the list of the literature I mentioned, combined with the Science of English Verse, which was the publication in 1920. Most of these were published after his death because he died so early in life. And here, if you had them on your bookcase, this is what the bindings would look like. Well, we have a very undistinguished monument here in White County. This happens to be right above Robertstown. And Mildred Greer, if you know her, she's been campaigning on me for about 6 years to do something about this monument. But it's a tribute to Sidney Lanier by the DAR chapter in 1936, showing his composition and a capability to do the Song of the Chattahoochee. So that resides there. Well, what can we take away from this? Well, the word that comes to me is perseverance. He persevered. The other thing was he stuck to his dreams. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. His uncle wanted him to be in hotel management in Montgomery, Alabama. He tried being a prep school tutor in Alabama. None of that worked. He wanted to be himself. He wanted to be in classics. He wanted to leave a legacy of music and literature. That's what he's done. There's one other note. We don't hear much about his Christian faith. But there's a hymnal, a hymn in the many hymnals, "Into the Woods My Master Went," which is considered an Easter hymn. And he reflects his Christian faith in some of the other poems. And as I reread those in the Marshes of Glen and another one about a stirrup cup, it tells you that he very much knew his life was not going to last much longer, and he was prepared with all the nature he'd observed, and he did pass away early. The other aspect is to be true to yourself. And why do I say that? Well, you may find there's somebody hiding in your suitcase that you need to write up, either a personality that influenced your life, or a family member, a musician, a writer, a music teacher, whatever. Do your detective work, think big, and then bring it to us. Perhaps we'll get you on one of these SNED programs. Thank you for your interest in Sidney Lanier.
Okay, questions?
I was wondering if there's a CD available commercially today with his music on it?
You might find one. I'm not sure. This lady that's the professional flautist, her last name is Robinson. I believe it's Susan Robinson. I can get that out for you. I happened to encounter her in Dallas, of all things. I was looking at upcoming programs in the Dallas theater there, and there she was coming, and then I found out she played Sidney Lanier. The other is a professor in Connecticut at Connecticut College. What is interesting, I was able to get one song because it was on YouTube. So you may find some of those on YouTube. I found that one and recorded it from there to bring it, transplant it and bring it to you here. But I'm not aware of an album. But if you can collect a few pieces of music like that, you can put them on your own CD, and then you've got it. And that's what my grandson helped me do this. So what I've got is one song interspersed with the gnats.
Other questions?
How does it feel to be related to Sidney Lanier?
Well, you know, first, if it comes to poetry, inadequate. Second, if it comes to music, woefully inadequate.
And how long have you known?
Well, let's say in the early 2000s, I started doing genealogy. And I found there's a great deal of information about the Lanier family. But I didn't have too much about Sidney Lanier. But in exploring that, and I have to say, the committee here and the group that's presenting challenged me, and I learned more, even as we prepared for this. So always be open to an opportunity to learn more. But I was inspired by his endurance, his perseverance, and his desire to leave a legacy. Now, all of us should have that desire, whether we do or not, and I ask myself that as well. But leave a legacy. Yes?
You said he had 4 sons?
Yes.
Did they go into any of arts, or did they, what happened with them?
His brother,
The question was, did his 4 sons go into the arts?
his brother Clifford was a fairly well-known poet back in earlier days, although he stayed with hotel management. The others you don't hear much about. They were more in business fields, and they stayed more in New York and up in that area. One I was curious about the last son is named Henry Wyson Lanier. Well, Henry Wyson was one of Sidney's favorite musician encouragers. That man worked more, in fact, I think had a great hand in getting him involved in the cantata for 1876. But he knew musicians in Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Hardly known at all in the South, and known in Macon or whatever, simply because the war-ravaged South, there was no, think about it. I thought about it suddenly. I said, gosh, there was no venue. What if he'd wanted to do any of that? Everything was gone, or nearly gone. But yes, he's noted for that up that way. And in fact, the lady, the professor from Connecticut College, when she came down, I went over especially, this is a little side note, I went over especially to Greenville, South Carolina. She was coming to North Greenville University to do a master's flute program. And I contacted her, and she says, yes, on Thursday I'll be doing a whole session on Sidney Lanier. And I said, would you mind if I sat in? And she said, sure. Well, 2 women there brought me magnolias. And I had a really hard time being from Georgia and knowing South Carolina with acting like I hadn't seen a magnolia before. But then she explained, as we talked a few minutes, she said, I had no idea there were Laniers in the South. So she knew the New York Laniers, which she had to approach to get the okay to do the music collection that they did from the Sidney Lanier Library collection in, well, the Eisenhower collection there. I actually sat at his desk at one point there. But I was astounded with how much material, and it's just overkill. I mean, you get swamped. So Sidney leaves me thinking, no music, no poetry, but I've got 3 sons and 6 out of 8 grandchildren that are either playing the piano or in the band playing some instrument in high school or middle school. And our granddaughter is playing the violin, and my wife's proud of that because her father played the violin. And she's quite an accomplished violinist and in the orchestra at Wheeler High School as a freshman. So.
Thanks, Charlie. Our final speaker is Michael Buchanan, who is a new Northeast Georgia convert, relatively new, and who is currently building a house in White County. He hails from the Atlanta area originally, taught school in Fulton County for 32 years, and since his retirement, he has become a filmmaker and writer, co-authoring a well-known book called The Fat Boy Chronicles. Many of you have probably heard of that. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Get my clicker thing here. Anyway, thanks for the invitation. And as a former teacher, I find it exciting to be part of this program because I've always believed that learning never stops. And so to be part of this is quite the honor. Like she said, I'm a writer, author, but I'm also an adventurer. And so today I'm going to talk about some things that I hope you find interesting. My first question is, well, this is a shark tooth. All right, how many of y'all would like to find one of these? Okay, well, I found it, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But first, where do I get my sense of adventure? Well, from my earliest days, I remember my parents throwing me in the car saying, come on, we're going somewhere. And sometimes it would be to the side of the road to pick up interesting rocks, sometimes to walk through dry creek beds looking for driftwood, or perhaps looking for arrowheads in my grandfather's field down near Covington, Georgia. Well, that sense of adventure has not left me. And today, it kind of has manifested itself in the fact that I'd still like to look for things, and especially fossils here in the Georgia and in the southeastern area. Oops, there we go. There's me. That's me diving in the river. But anyway, that search for things, I still like to stop on the side of the road and look for stuff. Or it might be in knee-deep water down in the coastal areas of the South looking for fossils. And in the most dangerous situation is when I'm in 10 to 50 foot of water in alligator-infested rivers in the low country of South Carolina. And so sometimes we're looking for things, and sometimes things are looking for us. And so that's why you have to be a little anxious and very careful. But so, how does that fit with today's talk? Well, first, let's go back in time. We're going to get in a time machine, and we're going to go back and see what was here before we were. Because all the things that were here before us, animals, have left their trace somewhere. In areas that have more erosion, they're more readily seen in the fossils records. But here in the southeast, it's a little bit harder to look to find them. And so what was here? Well, if we got in our time machine and there was windows here and we could look out the window, we would see, first of all, we'd see the roads turn back to dirt. We would see people in wagons and on horseback coming into the area looking for gold, whether it's in the creeks or the rivers, panning and things like that. If we went further back in time, we would see the Native Americans who lived here as they hunted deer And then there would be a time as we went further back in which we would see the first human walk into the area and look into the beautiful valleys and taste the sweet waters of the Chattahoochee for the first time. And then further back, there would be no humans. We would go back before the last glacial period in which animals lived here, but no people did. And the water at that time was locked up in glaciers. And so if you went to the beach back 13,000 years ago, you would have to go an extra 50 to 100 or 200 miles out to get to the shore. And so that's the way it was back then. And before that, animals lived here that do not anymore. Some of those that you would have seen if you lived here 15,000 years ago would have been on the upper left, would have been bison. There was the eastern bison that lived here. When the Europeans came here, the first Europeans, there were still buffalo living here in the east. In the middle upper part, there were horses that lived here, not the same kind of horses that the Indians and the cowboys would ride out west. Those were brought over by the Spanish years later. These horses were a little bit smaller, a little bit stockier, and they lived here in this area. In the upper right is a tapir. Those things still exist. They're kind of like a big pig with an elephant snoot, but they're in Central and South America. And if you were lucky and you were sitting on your back porch 15,000 years ago, you might feel the earth kind of tremble a little bit, and you look over, and over the rise comes a herd of woolly mammoths with their shaggy coats keeping them warm, and with their giant tusk, 8-10 feet long, weighing a couple of 100 pounds. And perhaps and then on the bottom right would be, there it is, would be their smaller cousin, the mastodon. So all of those things lived here, right here in these areas. And if you were lucky, you would see those. If you were unlucky, you might encounter this thing on the left, which would probably, ruin your day, I would think. And so that's a saber-toothed cat. And so they were here with their huge front teeth that could rip you apart in about a second or two. And on the right-hand side are things that moved kind of slow, and their descendants are still in the jungles of Costa Rica and around. And we know them as the sloths that we see, but these sloths were called ground sloths. And they were big enough that they could reach up and with one of their paws pull down an 8-10-foot tree limb and eat the leaves off of it. And they had these two massive claws on their front paws about that long, and if you got between them and their baby, or if you just, they felt threatened in any way, then they could probably reach out and do the same damage that the saber-toothed cat could. And so even though they were slow, they had huge potential as a threat. So what else lived here in the South? Well, that's back in the last, 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, and before that. Now we're in our time machine, we're going even further back in time. What else lived here? Well, let's talk about a few million years ago. If you look at the map of the Southeast and across Georgia in particular, you can see that on the left there is the town of Montgomery in Alabama, right over here. Then there's Columbus, then there's Macon, then there's Augusta, then there's Columbia. All of these cities line up across the South. That's because they're on what's called the fall line. And if you went back several million years ago, the ocean at that time wasn't frozen, it was more melted. And so the ocean covered the state of Georgia all the way up to those cities. So if you needed to go to the beach back then, you only had to go to Macon, or just a little bit past that, which would be kind of nice. But if you lived in Savannah and Charleston and all those areas, you'd be in a couple of 100 feet of water. And the reason a lot of those cities are in those spots is because that's as far up you could sail, because of the rocks and the rivers and all that, that's as high up as you could sail a ship back when people first came here. And so they said, far enough, we're going to build a town. So anyway, what lived in those waters that are now along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina and Florida and all that? Well, probably one of the greatest predators that's ever existed on Earth, certainly in the top 3, that would be Carcharodon Megalodon, the giant shark. And it would make a great white look like a goldfish. Okay? These things were big enough that just to get an idea of it, if you picture an 18-wheeler going down the highway one day, or if you see one, put a 6-foot dorsal fin on the top, take a tail twice that long and put on the back, and a mouth big enough that when it opened up and reached its maximum width, it would touch the top of a 9 or 10-foot room. And you could walk right in for its afternoon or morning snack. Right? That's the tooth that I showed you a minute ago is from one of those creatures. And so sometimes extinction is an okay thing because I would never be diving in the ocean if one of those things was swimming around. Great whites and bull sharks and all those guys, yeah, that's bad enough. But this is ridiculous. Okay. And so, and you can kind of get an idea of the people next to it. So they would get up to 50, 60 feet long. I have, the biggest shark teeth ever found are about 7.5 inches and measured from tip to back corner. And they're bigger than your hand. It's absolutely amazing. What else lived here? You go back even farther, back to the 60, 70, 80 million years ago, and before that in our time machine. On the bottom left is a creature that lived here in Georgia. Yes, there were dinosaurs here in Georgia. They roamed all over, but we don't find their bones just because of the erosion thing. But that one on the bottom, on the left there, that's an allosaur. It's a smaller version of the T-Rex. And if you go down to the Georgia-Alabama border below Columbus, near the banks of the Chattahoochee River, they have found allosaur teeth and allosaur bones and hydrosaur bones and things like that. So dinosaurs were here. And in the top is what's called a nautilus, a chambered nautilus. They exist in today's oceans, but you can go back 200 million years ago and find those things in the fossil record in Georgia and a lot of times in Alabama. And on the bottom right is probably the first creature to have ever seen the Earth. Several 100 million years ago, there was a creature called a trilobite. And if you notice these two little bumps right up here on the top, then those are its primitive eyes. So it was the first one to wake up one day and say, wow, look at this, okay? And so those are the things that lived here. And so we are just the more recent inhabitants. And when you think about all that's gone on in the state of Georgia, and then when the trilobites lived here, when these guys lived here, all of Georgia was covered with water. And so I have found fossils of those up near Carter's Lake on the top of or near the top of a mountain that was at one time in several hundred feet of ocean. And so these are some things that I brought today. And so I want to have these next door after we do our talks, when you can, at the reception. And we'll hear some of these things to show you, to prove that, yeah, these things were here. And all of these are things I've found, mostly diving in rivers here in the South. And so I always find it quite interesting. And even though I've found a few things, every time you find something new, it's a rush, let me tell you. And so on the upper left are spear points. Even though when we go diving in the rivers, you'll find fossils from 1 million years ago, shark teeth from 3 million years ago, and you'll find something from maybe the colonial times, and you'll find spear points from, even further back, and then you'll find a beer can. And so every time period is represented in the bottom of the river. And so on the upper right that's the tooth of a woolly mammoth. That's from a river down near the Georgia-Florida line. And that over there, that's the tusk of a mammoth. We don't ever find them in big pieces just because they kind of break up over time, I suppose. And once they get washed out, then they break up into maybe 1 foot, 2 foot long pieces. But they're still cool. And in the bottom middle, that's a horse tooth, and that's a buffalo tooth. So that's one of those, the teeth from those horses we talked about, and that's on the bottom there is an eastern bison tooth. The thing over here is a tapered jaw. I found that in the Cooper River down in South Carolina in about 50 foot of water. As I was fanning out the old mud and everything, and that kind of spilled out along with a couple of other things. So that's that pig-looking thing with an elephant snoot. And so those things are roaming around. In the upper left, that's the tooth of a mastodon. And the upper right is one of those chambered nautiluses. They look exactly the same as they did 200 or 300 million years ago. They really haven't changed, or they look today the same as they did way back then. They haven't really changed at all. It's like once something becomes kind of perfect, then it doesn't change very much. On the bottom, right there near the nautilus shell is, as most of y'all can tell, that's a sand dollar. That sand dollar just happens to be about 30 million years old, and I found it just below Macon, near Perry, Georgia, when you can go out in the woods there, and you can see the sand just like it was way back when. It was just like that's where the beaches came to, and I was talking about the fall line and all that stuff. And so it was sticking out of, there's an old quarry there, and it was just kind of, it hadn't moved since the day it died and laid on the beach, and it was just there, and I just kind of pulled it out. And so it's just amazing to think that stuff is still there, and it still looks just the way it did. And so on the bottom, these are shark teeth from, and that's a crocodile tooth, from that area near where they found the dinosaurs. I haven't found any of those dinosaur bones, but I will. And but those are sharks that, the thing about back then is that the Chattahoochee River-ish ended in a bay near Columbus, and so all the ocean predators would gather in that area waiting for things to wash down from the river to the river mouth, and then they would chomp on them. And so those are shark teeth that date back to the time of the dinosaurs. That's an oyster shell from that time period and before, and that's a scallop shell that's actually kind of big. And so a long time ago, scallops were like that big at times, and so you could really get your money's worth at Costco. On the upper left, these are Megalodon teeth, and I have both of these. All of these things you're seeing I'll have today with me. And so those are Meg teeth, and you don't find that many of them just because, you know, they were the top of the food chain, so they weren't swimming around like guppies, so they, you know, it'd be not near as many of them. So to find one of those teeth is kind of rare and pretty exciting. And these two things are from from Cumberland Island. When they dredged out for the submarine base down there, they dug through a lot of the fossil pits, or the fossil layers. And so those are sperm whale teeth. And then these last two things, this one up here is always for the kids in all of us, because that way everybody can kind of giggle and go, oh my gosh, really? Well, that, believe it or not, because these guys, the megalodons, were always eating fish, then, you know, they had a pretty good diet, I guess. And as they would go to the bathroom, then even that might fossilize. So believe it or not, this is fossilized poop from one of these guys. Okay? Well, people go, how on earth did you know that? I'm like, well, you kind of look and ask and all that, and like you look at it and go, oh, that's exactly. Okay? Down here in the very bottom is one of my favorite fossils I've ever found. It is the rib of a whale, and I call it my little snapshot in time. Because if you look carefully right here, you can see these little indentations, these little scratch marks. Well, actually, they're grooves. And if you take one of these teeth right here and you put it in those grooves, it fits perfectly. Because those grooves are bite marks from where a whale was eaten, whether it was still alive or after the fact, was eaten by one of these megs. And so that's a moment in time when one of those giant sharks was feeding on that whale. And so I think that's just kind of cool. So this is some footage that I took, just put some pieces together. That's me diving in the river. There's the contraption we wear. We have these lights on the top of our helmet and things like that so we can free our hands. We're looking in gravel beds. Things collect by density. So we're trying to find areas where the gravel is kind of collecting. And you can see the current going by, and when you're diving in rivers, you try to get there when the tide's going out, and so that the current takes the sand and the dirt away if you want to fan in a spot and look for stuff. And so you just kind of crawl around, and sometimes they're laying there just plain as day, but a lot of times they're not. That one, even though it's small, that's one I just, just the way it is. And here's me fanning on the bottom, and we look like some crazy creature down there, but it's kind of fun. And sometimes you find something pretty cool, as you'll see right here. And so that's one of those big teeth, and I'll have that in just a minute. And so it's fun. And like I said, it's always a rush every time you find something. Last summer we got in a really good spot, and we found about 30 pounds of shark teeth, not all like that, of course, like pieces and parts and some good ones that were small and a little bit bigger. And in one weekend, me and my dive buddy found about 35 pounds of shark teeth each. So that was pretty cool. And so anyway, hopefully this was interesting. These are some of the places that if you want to go do this, not everybody wants to go diving in rivers with alligators. That's kind of nuts. And my mom is always asking, are you sure you want to do this? I'm like, yeah, it's kind of cool. Our motto is, if we lived through it, we had fun. And so in the upper left, there's a Georgia Mineral Society. They have lots of great outings around the state and around the southeast where you can go with them and look for things. And a lot of times it's fossils. The trilobites are up near Carter's Lake. You can find shark teeth, maybe not that big, but sometimes after a storm on just about every beach in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida, especially on the Atlantic side. And you can go to Venice, Florida if you want to find even more shark teeth. There are people who will take you out for a fee, of course, into the inner parts of Florida. You can go sifting in the rivers and you can find who knows what. And one of the people actually found one of those claws from one of those giant ground sloths recently, and it's kind of rare. And you can find rocks around, and you can go diving. If you want to go do the diving thing, if that's something of interest to you, you have to have a license, and you have to report what you find and all that. And then other stuff. But the thing is, always ask permission if you're on private property, and enjoy the journey. Folks will ask me, they'll say, or they'll tell me like, oh my gosh, I wish I could go do this, and I wish I could find that kind of stuff. I'm like, you can. I mean, there's no special thing that I know. We just go. And so half the journey, or the most important part, is the first step to say that you're going to go. And then the rest of it is getting there and enjoying it. And a lot of times we don't find much of anything, but we sure do have a lot of fun in searching. And so I encourage you to get out there and find your own journey. And I can't wait to see what you find. And so thank you very much.
Okay, let's have a few questions for Mike, and then we'll adjourn to the Crittenden room and you can see the fossils up close. But by doing this, we might save some repetition because a lot of people may have some of the same questions. Yeah?
I'm assuming with your larger community of like-minded people with similar interests, is there a central repository of finds by your community where everybody can learn about the others, and maybe...
Yeah. You going to repeat it?
Good question. Is there a central repository for information about all these finds where people can go and get up to date?
Yes. I mean, it's not like a lot of people do this. A lot of people like to look for fossils and all that, but there's not that many people diving in the rivers. When you're out there with little 10, 12-foot alligators, it kind of cuts down on the competition a little bit. And but there at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, they collect data of what people find. I mean, if you found something ridiculously amazing, like a dugout canoe or something they haven't seen in 20 years, they would like to keep it for their museum. Usually, if you just report it, they're like, okay, that's cool, you can keep it. But there's places online, forums and stuff like that, where people will kind of talk back and forth. And just because most of the good places are south, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida, then they do have meetings of clubs, fossil groups, and things like that, where they'll meet once or twice or once a month and then just kind of show what they found. But a lot of it is even though people want to know what you found, they are polite enough not to ask where. Because if you find a decent spot, it's not like you want to announce it to the world because... that's happened sometimes, and you go back the next weekend and you're bumping heads with everybody that's out there, So, but it's a lot of people find it interesting. Yeah. Somebody else?
Are there professional guides that you can contact and take you out of? Stuff like that? I don't think
Yes.
I'm going to buy it.
Are there professional guides?
There's several people down in Florida, not so much in Georgia. There's a fellow named Mark Renz, and I have a couple of his books over there, R-E-N-Z. And you can look online, and it's called like Paleo Expeditions or whatever. And he will take you out. If you're ever doing a trip to Florida, this would be a cool thing. And he'll take you out into the creek, and they're not going to throw you in the river. You're not going underwater, but you'll be in waist-deep water, and you'll shovel up the bottom or this creek banks or whatever it might be. And they have these sifters, and you can find, you'll find shark teeth, you'll find turtle shells, you'll find bones of something, you have no clue what it is, and you'll work up a sweat and an appetite, but it is quite the adventure because you'll be in places that are very remote and like being on the set of Jurassic Park or something. And so if you look online, but Mark Renz is a good one, but there's several others that will take you out. If you know where Arcadia, Florida is, which is kind of east of Sarasota, you can rent a canoe and go down the upper part of the Peace River, take your sifter and your shovel, and just have at it yourself. And people find shark teeth and all kind of things. But you have to go, when the water is not up. So if it's after a hurricane, then it washes things out, but you can't really get down to the layers where you need to be. So you have to kind of know the water levels before you go.
How about Civil War relics, things like that?
Yeah, we found stuff like that. We've got cannonballs, and I've got bottles from the Revolutionary War. And the last time usually we're out there looking for other stuff, but everything is in the river. And so the last time we went, we were looking for shark teeth, and my buddy was fanning the bottom, and all of a sudden this perfectly intact dinner plate just kind of showed up, and it was from the 1820s or 30s. It was like somebody just zinged it like a frisbee right out into the river. And out of all those years of the water going up and down and rocks tumbling, it had never broken. And I was about ready to shove him back in the water and take it. So it was really cool. And
Mike, wait just a second.
Okay.
I just think that a lot of people may not know that Carter's Lake is really close to here.
yeah.
So you might want to tell where Carter's Lake is, because that's the closest.
It's really close to here.
Yeah. It's over near Ellijay.
It's over near Ellijay, yes, and there's some places just really on the side of the road where you can get in there, and there's these layers, and you just kind of take these rocks and kind of pop them open, and you'll find not like great fossils, they're more impressions, but they are trilobite examples from 300 million years ago. And it's just kind of amazing when every time you look at one, you know that you're looking at something that was swimming around in, 200 feet of water, of ocean water, and now it's on this ridge in North Georgia. So it's just an interesting thing. Sometimes the coolest stuff is not the rarest stuff, and so, just to imagine how things were.
Let's have one more. Who has
has one
one
in the
that they
front there.
think is, yeah, Nancy.
My daughter wants to know, do you ever help identify? She has lots of fossils that are in the ocean.
She wants to know if he ever helps people identify things. One of Nancy's daughters has a bunch of things that she's found.
Yes, people, when I taught, kids were always bringing stuff in, and like, what is this? And so, yeah, that's fine. I mean, everything that I've learned was from books and asking questions, And so if you're curious about things, then you'll find the people that know and ask them, and then listen. And so sure, I'd be glad to help in any way. And Edisto is kind of near where we find a lot of these things, so I'm sure it's probably a lot of, similar items, if not exactly the same.
Okay, well, let's continue next door. And thank you all again so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Mike.